Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Critters. Kind of an unexpected because I think I've seen bits and pieces of the Critter franchise. Like, I probably maybe caught a random movie here or there late at night at one point. And so, reasonably, like, I think I caught like a tail end of one of these, and I'm like, you know what, I don't think this is probably going to ever be something that I'm actually going to watch. And then I just finally sat down. And I'm like, you know what? Like, this movie would always like pop into my brain every once in a while. Just be like, you know what? Like, I never watched this movie. Yeah, I never watched it. Like, maybe I should check it out. What it is? What does it entail? So I kind of came into this movie blind because really I just wanted to check out like how much that like where this movie went to. And man, once I searched this movie, I'm like, holy cow! Like there was like four of these Critter movies, and there were like spin-off kind of movies where it's like Critters Attacked and Critters Bounty Hunter, and all of a sudden I found out that there was like a Critters series. I was like, wow, this thing took off. This thing had a following. And I was kind of surprised by that. So, like, I went on, you could go into either two apps that I've been using consistently called See Movies, or you can go into an app that I've been using called Fox HD Movies. That has the logo say that, but I think the title says Play 1080p Movies. But if you search the word Fox HD Films, you can find the same thing in Google Play. If you're a mobile user or a tablet user, whichever, I found these apps on both of those things. So go ahead and find that if you want to go and check all these Critter things out. Because you're like, this sounds interesting after I hear this man review this film. Or, hey, like, I used to like these as a kid, and now I want to get back into them because all of a sudden I hear series, and I'm like, say what now? Like, how did this thing get so well to have a series? Um, but yeah, so I finally decided to watch one of these, and I'm like, well, normally always what I do is I always do the very original thing and then go further on into that. So if all of a sudden I review this thing and it magically deliciously just takes off, then I will be more than willing to watch any number of these films, the series, whatever is actually going to be popular. That is the thing that I'm more than likely happy to review or watch. Uh, but more than likely, maybe all of this is all forgotten, but it seems bizarrely this had such a cult following. I was actually just really unsure about what was to go on in this film. And so I honestly, for this movie, was honestly just at the edge of my seat because I didn't know what to expect. And then once I went into this movie and kind of saw what was going on in the film, I kind of got off my edge of my seat and kind of like relaxed in my chair. And I was like, oh, okay, like this actually is a pretty decent film. Like, I honestly, in brutal honesty, for this movie, I kind of wanted a little bit more bang for my buck, if you know what I mean, to watch this film. But considering I watched this for free, like that's a bizarrish term to say, but like it kind of felt for an 85-minute film, like you have to wait like half an hour to get to the critters part. And I was kind of like, and plus also you have to wait a while to get to the bounty hunter versus critters part. Like I kind of wish that there would have been kind of like a more like I wish that the critters would have been like all over the town, and like the bounty hunters would have had to consistently like try to get at these things. Like I thought that that would have been a much more exciting approach, but maybe eventually when this movie has a much more bigger budget, then maybe that's when we're going to start to see like all kinds of like critter-esh like things. And maybe I'm just kind of like, hey man, like they had to start somewhere, and they started here. Funny enough, like we have uh, Dee Wallace that has been in seemingly any like horror movie. Like I see her somewhere in a horror film all the time. Like I remember her in Cujo, but I think she's been in a plethora of horror films. I think every single time I end up like having to see this woman in some horror movie somewhere, and I'm like, man, like she was in a lot of these, a lot of horror movies. Every time I end up seeing her in a movie somewhere, and I think every time I always use the Cujo thing. But anyways, so I spent too much time kind of like critiquing this movie or whatever, but not enough time describing this movie, so I apologize. So and some people may not even care, so it's perfectly okay. Or people may like just be like, "Yeah, he did this movie, awesome. Let me check this out," and then they'll thank you. Anyways, so the teeing up of this film, so we have these outer space bounty hunters that have to make their way forcibly onto Earth because these krites or critters have escaped from their prison holding cell to make their way onto Earth and are going to tear apart and try to consume some of these farm like family members. We get probably a pretty decent like 30 some odd minutes where we're having to live a leave it to beaver like lifestyle, and then eventually there is this slow build to the critters and like slow ash like builds because eventually they just start popping off and start falling out of places and all of a sudden start growing into man like size, and I'm like, wait a minute, what? Like I didn't expect like the critters to grow into man size. I'm like, man, these critters are doing all kinds of things. Like I was probably at the edge of my seat in the very beginning of this film, and then I kind of went back to my seat. But then I was kind of like, wait, what a minute? Wait a minute? Like critters, I thought small ball things, right? No, eventually they get fairly larger. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. All right, like you've got my attention. Like when like this, like these critters, like for the most part, like they look like, of course, ugly because they do. But you know what? Like, there was something about him, like, when I was watching this movie where I was like, you know what? Like, this could also be, like, one of those, like, kind of cute little things, too. Like, cute little things? Cute, adorable things? No. Like, they're vicious, but also I was just like, you know what? I could just like these things too. I can enjoy them. Like yeah, they're scary, but also I can also enjoy like this movie. And so like unexpectedly I was enjoying this film while also being just a tweed bit just kind of like yeah, this is kind of just uh like I kind of wanted to just consistently keep hitting me with things instead of being like this slow build. Like I wanted to just keep on like coming at me. Like I don't like I didn't like the movie where it was like this slow build of things. Like it's either just like really hit me with it, like really keep getting at me with it, or just don't do it at all. Just have a whole entire movie where it's just the Leave It to Beaver family, and then the bounty hunters just blast all the way through all the critters, and then they just leave, and then just that's the movie. They just easily find the critters and just kill them, and then just like that's it. Um, so yeah, like the bounty hunters bizarrely are trying to understand this world, and so you get a lot of that where the bounty hunters are just throughout this town just wreaking havoc and just blowing stuff up just because they can. I was kind of interested in like how big was the budget for this movie because I would have made the consensus that this movie like should have been really really cheap, but they did all these like explosions and I'm like, dude, every time you do one of these explosions that costs something. So I was expecting this movie to be like severely cheap, but then all of a sudden they just kept like having the bounty hunters like blow things up and crash through these buildings and just annihilate a home. And I was just immediately thinking, I'm like, that has to cost something. But so, like, how is it like this movie must have just like really interested a lot of people, evidently. Like everyone must have been excited about when Critters came out. Because I think they were just at a time where they probably just liked little small things, and plus I guess people also loved Trebles, I guess, from Star Trek, so maybe that was a thing. I don't know. But I think it's time. I spent way too much time talking about this cryptically. I think it's about time to go into this spoiler wise, because, yeah. So, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about the time we to spoil this movie. Um, Probably the most interesting thing about this movie is probably the beginning of the movie and probably towards the end of the movie, where the bounty hunters actually go into the home and start blowing stuff up and killing all these things. Everything in between that was just kind of like, meh, let's get to the part that everybody like came here for. Like the long build up, and then eventually we see, oh yeah, the critters appear, and then they start wreaking havoc. Like, okay, that could probably be scary to some people. Not gonna lie, like I'm always gonna be honest with people. Like, it'll probably be scary to some people. Like, once I got to understand like the setup of what these things do, I was like, oh, okay, all right, like, cool. Like, if anything, there was something about these little things that I was like, you know what, like, I'm sure, like, I can understand, like, some people could bizarrely just find these things, like, in their own way, just like, yeah, I like critters, yeah, that's cool. Like, because, like, there's some people that like those, like, bizarrish, like, teddy bears that, like, have those weird, bizarrish designs to them. So, like, critters might be the same thing to some people. With that whole setup. So people might have been like one of those kind of creep out kind of people that are like, oh no, I love the critters. It's great. But anyways, so let's get into it. So the very beginning of this movie, we have uh, this this uh, this meteor or this like comet like thing, this like rock that is floating into space, this big rock that's floating into space that eventually has some outer space prison that keeps things inside of it. But it seems that this bizarre looking alien that I don't know that alien's actual name. There's a couple of names in the IMDb that didn't show up right away, and like I would assumed that that main alien that sends out the bounty hunters might have been Zanti, Zanti. Like, I don't remember if it ever said the alien's name, but I will just call it Alien. First A6. Um, so the critters are to commandeer a spaceship and go onto Earth, and so this alien is to send out these two bounty hunters that I guess could change into the form of whatever their planet they are to go to, which I guess makes them the perfect assassins and or bounty hunters because they can change shape to look like anybody from this planet. Uh, but also they can change shape to look like celebrities, I guess, because that's one of the chosen form of one of these people. So, so the critters are to eventually crash land into this farm, and then so are also the bounty hunters are to land onto the planet. But here's the thing, though: we have to have like a 30 some odd minute lead up to eventually these critters getting a little nibble on some people, because we had this whole like Leave It to Beaver family. Um, Dee Wallace, if I mention this, I'm like, she's in so many horror films. I didn't realize she was in so many horror films. Uh, the guy that plays Brad in this movie, I'm like, what? Where have I seen him from? And I'm like, Orville. Like, I was like, wow, he looks so young here. Like, it's so weird. But yeah, the guy who is in Critters, Orville. Wow, that's funny. So, anyways, let's go. So we have this Leave It to Beaver like family that like April is calling her is giving a little jangle to one of her boyfriends. The boyfriend ends up being Billy Zane. If you guys remember who the Phantom is, that guy. Um, so April is to call her boyfriend over for them to just go making out into the barn. And so this is all to eventually lead, because there's just a lot of like you have like Jay Brown, who's the father of this, who is like kind of doing his barn like stuff. And really, this a lot of this movie is both Brad and April who are consistently getting at one another. Brad at some point is to use a slingshot on his sister, or the town drunk is to eventually use a slingshot on April, and all kinds of things. Just kind of goofy kid stuff that eventually get one or the other in trouble. Eventually, Brad gets grounded for 2 weeks without movies. But bunch of just malarkey stuff. Let's get into the more meat and potatoes of this movie. So, like, if anything, like, we're gonna skip to the good things. So, it's just a lot of buildup that I was just kind of like, come on, like, give it to me, give me that good stuff. So, let's get to it. So, the critters are to make it onto planet Earth, and so immediately what they do is they consume a cow. So, considering like Brad was trying to sneak out of the house and climb down on this tree, Jay had seemed to have this earthquake, and so Jay is going out to just kind of check on the barn to see if anything like happened. And so while he's going and checking out what that noise was, he is to also see Brad, who is coming down from this tree. And so Jay's like, "Hey, what are you doing there?" And Brad's like, "I'm in a tree. Yeah, I just got like that. This earthquake just shot me out of my window onto this tree. Isn't that crazy, Dad?" And Jay is like, "Yeah, yeah, come on down. Like, I know you're trying to sneak out." So, because evidently Brad likes playing with firecrackers, and that's evidently what he was doing with Charlie, the town drunk, or the town imbecile. I don't know. I don't know exactly what his actual title of this town, because it seemed like he was a guy with just kind of all kinds of weirdness to him. So it didn't seem like they classified what this guy's weirdness is. So it doesn't matter. So Brad and Jay go out to find this cow being all chewed up, and they're like, "What could have done this? I don't know." Jay is only going out there with a flashlight, not a gun, and so once they see this cow being chewed up, and eventually the critters start to scatter away, you can't really see anything. Jay is like, "I don't know what that is, but I'm not gonna come back here without my gun present, and then I'll come back and like see what the heck this is." So eventually, nothing really actually happens until the power is to go out in this house. Because Jay eventually is to call the sheriff, and eventually the phone lines go out, and so Jay is like, "Well," because nobody has cell phones on them because it's 86, I guess. They just have a landline. And plus, also, I'm sure they would come up with some kind of like, "Oh, the critters took out the cell phone tower. Oh no." They would come up with some convenient thing. So, so the critters are to be down in this basement where Jay is to eventually go into, or attic, or no, wait, the basement. Sure. So Jay is to go and have to figure out what happened with the breakers because the power had went out in the house, and so like considering they don't know what's going on, so Jay is to eventually go into the basement to try to pull the breakers and get the power back on, but eventually he sees that cords are ripped, that any number of things could possibly happen now that Jay is now in the attic. You would have honestly thought if Jay would have been smart about this and he said like, "I'm not going anywhere without my gun," you would have thought that this guy would have had like a billion guns all over his home, and he would just be like, "Oh yeah, here's my one of 500th gun that I have in my house. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab this one and just go with me everywhere I go now because like something's going up or something's happening." But no, this guy just comes with a flashlight. And here's also my problem. When you have something moving in a room, immediately I would just be like, you know what? I'm just going to go and grab a bat, a torch, a flamethrower if you have one handy, or I would probably grab this thing called a gun, because it seems like that's the most common thing. A lot of people tend to have them. Well, like I wouldn't have one, but like common thing would probably be to like grab a big gigantic knife or probably bat or broom or something. But I'm taking too much time for this, so Jay is to just take hand, I say to you, and go and he's seeing something moving in this room, so he's going to take his hand to just touch this thing to see what it is. What a moron. What a real true moron. Good for him to be a moron because, anyways. So Jay takes hand, touches Critter, and then eventually the critters are like, well, dude, he touched one of our friends. We need to attack him now. So all of a sudden, all these critters start coming out of the woodwork. They freaking pounce on Jay onto his shoulder. And I'm like, like, this is popping off. All right. So all of a sudden, these critters start biting onto onto Jay, and eventually like Jay tries to make it out of onto the stairwell, and one of the critters come out of a part of the stairwell to grab onto Jay's like knee and start biting on him. And I'm like, yeah, like that's what happens when you don't bring your gun to a critters fight. That's what happens. You get nibbled on to the point of like consistently it feels like these people are severely ill equipped, and I'm like, these people are in a barn. You would think they would have just a number of all kinds of random like a shovel or a weapon or something like everywhere that they could just use, but no. Like I just thought that that was just so bizarre to me. Like you would think at the very like bare minimum, like these people would have a shovel like everywhere they are to look, cause barn. But like I would just think like these people would have a number of shovels somewhere, but I guess I'd be wrong. So Jay is to just get eaten and nibbled by these critters, to eventually the family is like trying to protect like Jay from consistently getting hit by or eaten by these things, eventually kind of taking this like taking things to like kind of knock these things off. And like also like the interesting thing that I found out about, like one of these critters has these like porcupine like spike things that come off as like a projectile. I'm like, wait a minute, that seems cool. Like I'm like, okay, like so if you're thinking that these things are gonna be like close combat kind of things, no, there's actually also like the long distance kind of critters that hit you with these like darts or whatever, these like spike like things that come out of their like bate, and I'm like, wow, this is actually really cool. So so they eventually like close their attic, and now they're kind of like bunkering down in their home, and they're like, oh my god, like like we are probably going to die. Like these things are probably going to come from any number of places, and like we are probably going to not be prepared from where these people come at. Here's also the dumb thing. These people go into their living room that probably has the most easy access to a number of windows, also chimney, but also any number of places that this thing could come in from. You would have thought that they would have picked a much more secure like room that has like the least amount of windows or no windows whatsoever, like quite possibly like a bathroom, because normally bathrooms don't often have windows a lot of times. But um like looking at this bathroom in this movie, there isn't any windows in that. But eventually, a critter goes bizarrely into the toilet, and bounty hunter takes it out. So these bounty hunters are. Wait a minute. Let's a little bit. So the critters are to eventually make their way to this barn. And before they do, they eventually go and nibble and just eat this deputy, but eventually make their way back to this barn because they take out the cow, then they go for this deputy, but then they go back to the barn because eventually they couldn't find a food source anywhere around here, so they went back to the barn. So eventually the bounty hunters are to see this deputy, and finally the other cloned individual appears and looks like the deputy. And so immediately the other bounty hunter sees a bunch of clips of music, and he becomes a musical star named Johnny Steele while they're in the spaceship and while they're trying to change into someone. And so the other guy just turns into this deputy that kind of was mangled and chewed up, but he just turns into that. So they go into this car and they don't understand, of course, how the car works. So bizarrely, they're repetitiously driving this car backwards. And bizarrely, these people eventually drive this car backwards and crash into a church. And so the bounty hunters go into this church and ask where the Krites are. And they're like, Krites? Like the power of Krites compels you? I don't know what you're talking about. So they go into this church and start blasting away at this organ because it made a sound. And all of a sudden, the deputy now changes into the preacher, and the second guy is now like a preacher now. The preacher. So eventually they're looking for the Krites. It doesn't seem like they can find them there, so they move on. So all of a sudden they figure out how to drive forward. And so now they are driving around. And so Charlie the public drunk is to have seen these bounty hunters land on Earth. And so Charlie is freaking out and is wanting to call the sheriff because there's an alien invasion among us. And so the call girl of this sheriff's department is now freaking out because she has repetitiously trying to get the deputy on the line, and he has not answered. Because eventually the deputy was trying to hit on the call girl and consistently ask if they could have donuts or something together. And the call girl just says, no, I'm not interested, or she comes up with some kind of reason that she's washing her hair or whatever. But anyways, so eventually this public drunk goes to the sheriff's place. It's like, dude, you gotta get Harv on the line. You gotta get to this sheriff and let him know things are about to go down. Spaceships are landing, all kinds of craziness. And so it gets to the point where eventually these bounty hunters make their way to the bowling alley, and Charlie is to also make his way to the bowling alley. And so Charlie is to mention about aliens landing and all kinds of things, and this guy at this bowling alley is like, dude, I'll give you this whole entire bottle if you just shut up. Like, I just don't, like, I just don't want to hear any of this. So, eventually these bounty hunters make it to the bowling alley, and they are to all of a sudden, like, they're looking for these krites, but bizarrely they're also doing some odd stuff too. One of the bounty hunters takes one of these bowling balls and grabs it via his hand, and then he bizarrely, like, chucks the bowling ball to where it breaks all the pins into, like, powder. And everybody's like, oh my god, like, what bowling league is he in? And so, of course, the bounty hunters eventually get to the bar of this bowling alley and are asking for where the krites are, and nobody has an answer. And then eventually the preacher now turns into Charlie, that looks a little bit more like looks a little bit more a slick back, cleaner version of Charlie, even though he probably still has a 5 o'clock shadow for facial hair. So now we have the bowling alley people at the sheriff's spot and are now, like, finally complained about these bizarre bounty hunters that are to look really weird. And so the call girl is now having to get the sheriff and wake him up. And he's like, what is going on? Like, where is Barnes? And, like, the girl's like, I've been calling him all night, but I can't get him, and things are popping off here, Sheriff. And so the sheriff is like, well, just give me 10 minutes. So the sheriff is going to the church, and the sheriff is trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And eventually this is to lead to eventually the bounty hunters eventually making it to the barn, but it takes a while. So and then also the sheriff makes it there also, but the sheriff is kind of ill-equipped, and by the time the sheriff makes it to the barn, basically, like, the bounty hunters are already there and they're blowing clear cut through everything, and so the sheriff is kind of out of his element. So let's get to this. So the family has, like, they're all in the living room, and so that is a very stupid decision to make, because what ends up happening is the critters make their way through this home. It seems like every time that they're starting to eat something, like, especially one of the critters is starting to get even bigger and bigger and bigger compared to some of the others, which seems weird. So till eventually one of the critters, like, becomes the size of a man, which I thought was really cool, but also I was like, what happens if they just continue to just eat things? Will they just be, like, Godzilla-like size, and then no one will be able to take them down? It seems like Brad gave one of these critters, because eventually Brad had to run off to the barn, because eventually both April and her date, who is Billy Zane eventually had his fingers, like, chopped off when he was to go and try to adjust the radio. One of the critters ate his fingers and then ate also Billy Zane. And so April is kind of screaming and yelling, and Brad eventually goes and saves April by giving one of these critters, like, a thing of dynamite that he eats and then keels over after eating. And then so April and Brad make their way into the home, and, like, they're stuck in the living room, and eventually one of the critters, I think, tries to make it through the chimney. Another critter tries to make it through a window, and then eventually it seems like all the critters are in this living room. And so they, of course, have the shotgun, but it seems like it's really hard to get a number of these bullets. Or eventually it seems that the shotgun, I want to see rifle. This double barrel shotgun, let's say that, eventually quickly runs out of bullets. I'm like, wow, that kind of sucks. Like, you would have thought that this guy would have had, like, a huge box of them, but I guess not. He only had like 2 to 3 shots worth, probably. Wow, that sucked. So, because this guy just had them all in his pocket, and this is probably the worst dad to have, like, shotgun shells in his pocket, because this guy just gets eaten consistently by these critters, repetitiously. So, the critters are to be in the living room, and eventually one of these pins that comes out of one of these critters is to hit the mother, and she is to go down. But they're to try to drag her off. So eventually, it just kind of gets to the point to where they try to like flip these couches, and then the critters are eating through the couch, try to get to these people, and Brad is to go back into the living room to try and uh, try to, I think, get the shotgun, and so but eventually the critters eat through the couch, and so Brad is like running up to the stairs above, and eventually the critters, I think, try to like nibble at him, but eventually he gets up to the flight of stairs, and as they make it to where Brad is at, eventually Brad tosses this lantern to try to scare these critters from making it to them. And then eventually, both Brad and April flip this carpet over that the flame was on, and it douses the flame out. Luckily, because that would have sucked if all of a sudden this house would have been burnt on fire. That would have been crazy. So everybody goes into this room, and here's the thing that I don't quite understand. So eventually one of the critters comes into man-like size, because eventually they start tearing through a lot of the chickens or just a lot of the other animals in this barn, and eventually they grow into size. And eventually the last bit of this movie is to eventually see that in the chicken coop that these critters had laid eggs, sadly enough. I wonder if in the sequel that continues on from this first movie to show that these eggs had hatched or whatever. I'm sure it might have been a completely different thing altogether. Who knows? But anyways, so uh, so these people are now in this room where there's only like one window and there's a door. And so eventually they're kind of like putting all kinds of furniture to hold off any number of these creatures making it, or critters, through either one of these entryways. But eventually it seems the bigger critter is to eventually go into this window and try to grab onto one of the people. I'm like, wait a minute. If this is the floor above, how is this creature like breaking through this window and all kinds of things as if it's still on the first floor? That seems kind of weird to me. Like, it kind of feels like a first floor kind of window. Like, it doesn't feel like a second floor kind of window. Like, that didn't quite make sense to me, but maybe I'm kind of not seeing this correctly, because it feels like it's all still on the first floor. But I don't know. Maybe this creature just had this bizarrish, like, roof-like talent of something. I don't know. But eventually, this critter, eventually this bigger critter, goes through and kind of like takes out the drawers of this thing, and eventually starts grabbing onto April. And so these critters start like going and are starting to break into this spot, but eventually it seems that after they start to scare away the bigger critter, and eventually after they start really like holding out these doors, eventually the family is to decide, like, dude, we need to call out for somebody. Like our phones are dead. We don't have cell phones because it's 86. And so we need to go out and have somebody run out and yell for help. Like, have someone help us. So Brad is like, you know what, I think I'm going to have to be that person, because I think I'm the fastest, and I think I can go and, like, get my bike and go for help. And so the family is like, you know what? I think that's something that you have to do. And the mom is kind of like knocked out. Like, I guess she's so exhausted from all the screaming and yelling and scaring that she was a part of. So she just passes out, but then eventually wakes up like hours later. She's like, hey, how long have I been out? A while. Um, and eventually they run out of bullets in the shotgun, the double barrel. So they're like, ah, crap. I think the coolest part is when like they are to drag the father into the front of the house, and then they're trying to like defend themselves in the very front of the house. That scene is really cool, and like Brad having to run around into the house to figure out which spot that he can get into the house with, to eventually him having to like climb up that tree and then like kind of go from tree to rooftop to get into the house that way and try to unlock the door and have the family come into the house. That was a really cool sequence. I think that part was the best part of this movie, was how they were trying to get back into the house once the house was like supposedly locked out for everybody, when they were trying to get into all the cars and the critters chewed through all the cars. They were trying to make their way out, and they just decided that they needed to go right back in. So Brad is to decide to go out and try to make it to his bike, to try to make it to help. And so Brad goes off and tries to get to his bike, and immediately there's a critter right by his bike, and the critter is to knock the bike over and just like, yeah, like the one thing that you were probably going to do, yeah, that's not going to happen. So Brad is to eventually try to sneak away into one part of this barn and eventually see like where the critters are going to, and like see if like they are not going to go and be where he is, so he can figure out like a quiet spot to eventually just start scooting away kind of thing. So Brad is to run for his life after this, and eventually there is a police car that is just driving all over the place that is of the bounty hunters, and Brad is to like wave them down, and they almost hit Brad. And so the car stops, and Brad is like, "Oh, thank God! Like I found you guys." And then like he ends up realizing that they're the bounty hunters and they're not like the normal police officers. So Brad is like, "Ah, whatever. Like if anything, you can probably help my family out regardless." And they're thinking of like, or they're asking like this guy. It's like, "Hey, like where are the Krites?" And that's when the uh, like Brad is like, "Oh, the little things, the critters," and then the one guy that looks like Charlie's like, "Yeah, that's like I guess they call them critters, like Krites critters." So yeah, like that must be it. So they go and drive to where this barn is, and like Brad thought that like here's the fun thing. So Brad thought that this Charlie knew where Brad lived, and no, this is a different Charlie. So I'm like, yeah, that's actually really smart. So that was a good thing that they did. So Brad is like, dude, I'll tell you where my house is. Like, just go and wipe this thing out. So now we have this spot where like the bounty hunters are going and like trying to get through this house, trying to clear cut all of the critters from this barn, or from this home slash barn. And so eventually the bounty hunters are making their way to the family's room, and so then the family could completely get out of this house. And that's when the sheriff arrives, and he's like, what the heck is going on? And immediately the sheriff is like, dude, get in my car and just like wait it out here, and I'm gonna go and check out what's going on. And so we just start seeing the bounty hunters who are just blowing away all of these like critters, and it looks pretty cool. Eventually, one of the critters, after getting hit with the flames by Brad, eventually one of the critters goes in the toilet, and one of the bounty hunters finds the critter in the toilet and shoots him and blows up the toilet, but also like takes down the critter. To where the bounty hunter is just grabbing like a piece of the critter to say like, well, I guess he's dead. So like eventually we start seeing these like critters start to come out of the woodwork, and eventually we start seeing like these bounty hunters just blowing up this house. It looks awesome. And so the sheriff eventually is to go into the house, and Charlie is to grab this sheriff and chuck him out a window, to where Jay is going after the sheriff and like, hey, like, sheriff, are you okay? And like I think like the sheriff was like something like, well, like, I think I'm out of my element here. I think I should back away. So eventually we have the bigger of the critters eventually go and grab April and drag her to their spaceship with whichever critters are left. And so now we have where the whole entire family, or a bulk of the family, is in the car. Like, Brad is consistently hanging out with these bounty hunters, just trying to see like them like clear out this entire house, which I thought was like, yeah, like of course the kid is just with these bounty hunters as they're like clearing through the entire house. So so the bounty hunters are to go back into their deputy car to realize that the deputy's car no longer works. So the bounty hunters are looking over at the sheriff's car, and the sheriff is like, oh, crap. So the entire family is to go into this car, plus sheriff, plus bounty hunters. And so, oh, I think Brad went off on his own bike, and so did also like Charlie bumps into Brad on his bike, trying to make it to like find these bounty hunters, because he's like, hey man, I really want to talk to you guys. Like, I really want to like meet you and whatever. But anyways, so critters are making it into their ship, and so the bounty hunters are also just making it to their ship as well. So Brad uh, is to eventually take his sister back, and now they're trying to figure out how exactly to kill these critters. And so they make the plan of like, well, like Brad tries to chuck his firecracker in there, but it didn't work. It didn't work out to where it could explode anything. So eventually, Charlie is to have a thing of hooch and a towelette or something. So so Charlie asks Brad to light this thing, because evidently Brad has a lighter. So uh, Charlie takes this and chucks this almost Molotov like cocktail into this ship, and it burns up the ship and then blows stuff up. And like also it's kind of interesting to have these critters talk to one another, because even at some point like one of the critters end up saying like the F word in this movie, which I thought was funny. When one of their critters was to blow up, like the other critter looks at the one critter that had been blown up and it's like, "Fa!" And so he like runs off because eventually one of his friends is dead. Um, but yeah, so the Molotov cocktail gets shot into the ship, and the ship eventually is to lift off, and then eventually they are to see the cocktail, and like, oh crap. And then the ship blows up, but while the ship also blows up, so does also this guy's house along with it. Like the people that had the barn, like their house just blows up. And so much destruction, so much carnage at the tail end of this movie. And so after the bounty hunter had, I guess, seemingly thought that he had covered every bit of all these critters, and like I guess so like thumbs up, I think we got him. The Johnny Steele looking bounty hunter is eventually, like, I think because he was won over so much by Brad that that the Johnny Steele bounty hunter gives Brad this like calling card that like, hey, call me. Like, and then so the bounty hunters go off and I guess are gonna go back to their planet because their job is done. And Charlie is to beg them, hey, I'm a really good mechanic. Maybe I can fix something. Like, maybe I can go along with you guys. Like, if anything, maybe you might need a an Earth ambassador. You know what? Maybe like he's trying to like beg them or bargain with them to go with them. Um, but yeah, so all of a sudden, Brad is to kind of hear this like this thing go off, this little device that this bounty hunter is to give him. So Brad is to just touch this device, and all of a sudden, his entire home is getting rewinded. Like basically meaning that when his house was to completely get destroyed and annihilated and whatever, all of a sudden his house is starting to completely reform and be as perfect as it was before. All of a sudden, the cat is all of a sudden getting dragged back into the home. And bizarrely, we have this cat who is to appear in this mailbox, sadly. And so, like, Brad is getting the cat out of the mailbox. And so, yeah, like, so the house is back to normal. And I wonder how they cut all of this because more than likely they probably would have had to cut the ending first and then probably gone into like destroying everything afterwards so they can just have that ability to just be like, well, yeah, like we perfectly did everything because why would they rebuild this home? They could have just easily annihilated it because it seems like it's in the middle of nowhere. So I think they could perfectly just blow up. So really after that, like it just goes to really just showcasing that the critters had laid eggs somewhere, and that's really just the end of this movie. So, holy crap, I spent 52 minutes talking about this. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, buddy. Bye, everybody.